Hello, everybody. Welcome to this workshop, Transformation of a City, Adaptive Reuse, which is hosted by BRE. It's part of the Circuit project. So we have the link to the Circuit website in the screen that you can see at the moment. So I'd really urge everybody to maybe have a look at that website later to get more information on the whole project, but also the various aspects of the project. Hopefully you've all come from the plenary session, so you've had a pretty good overview of the circuit project itself. We're now going to focus on one of the aspects of it, which is all about adaptive reuse. So I think Kay is supporting me, so I don't know if we could maybe move to the agenda. Or no, we don't have the agenda. Okay, all right, so here's today's agenda. So I'll just be doing a bit of a welcome and introduction. Then we're going to go to Robert Schmidt III, who's from Loughborough University, and he's going to talk about the process of activating a building and community's capacity for change. Then we're going to go to Elma Durmisevic from 4D Architects, amongst many other hats that she wears, looking at buildings' capacity for future reuse, and there'll be two pilot cases, which will be, I'm sure, going to be very fascinating to run through. And then finally, we've got Peter Swallow from Grimshaw's Architects, who will be looking at the another demonstration project or pilot case, which is the reimagining of the Herman Miller building. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. Okay, so hopefully everybody is ready to go, and I'm just going to do a very, very quick intro into adaptive reuse, and why do we think it's important to do this as part of the circuit project, which in itself is very much linked to circular economy in the cities, and how do we actually achieve this in reality. So I suppose it's got a little tagline, which is extending life cycles through transformation and refurbishment, and that's really, I suppose, the key phrase there is extending life cycle. And there are various definitions for adaptive reuse, but the one that I quite liked was reusing an existing building or asset for a purpose other than which it was originally built or designed for. This is also called repurposing, so quite often you'll hear the phrase repurposing along with adaptive reuse or transformation. So why is it important, and how does that link to circular economy? I just listed from my own perspective what I think some of the key reasons are. I mean, the main one is it actually prevents demolition. So if you have an asset, so I'll just talk about buildings, so it could be an infrastructure asset, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a building. So say you have a building and it's no longer fit for the purpose for which it was intended. So the pictures here are from the Tate Modern Art Gallery, and that was originally a power station. So they actually they adapted the something which for a very different purpose into an art gallery. So that is a very good example, I think, of adaptive reuse. And the alternative would have been that entire structure, which included many hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete potentially, would have been demolished, and then something else would have been put on its spots, again potentially using thousands of tons of concrete and other materials. So by reusing that asset and changing it to a different purpose that was actually now required or was useful at this point in time, prevented that demolition and all the waste production associated with it. And the problem with demolition is it's not so much the fact that we do need to have regeneration in the urban environment, but the issue is that a lot of demolition inevitably leads to downcycling or even landfilling of those resources. So you lose some of that resource use by just through the process of demolition. Even if you can actually reuse some of the products, there's inevitably going to be wastage and breakage in that process. Another key area is, it can help to retain culturally, aesthetically important built assets. It can maintain the townscape, buildings that people are familiar with, people love. you know, may not be useful for that purpose. If we can change it to another purpose, then it can still be useful in the built environment. So some of these examples are churches, for example, where they've changed. You don't want to demolish the church, but you can actually then, if it's no longer fit for that use, then there's plenty of examples where they've been converted into things like bookshops, cafes, even hotels. I think I went to one. So you've kept that structure that's important to that area. Also, disrupting local disruption through demolition and then redevelopment can be quite high. So things like, you know, the transport movements of heavy goods and waste can be quite disruptive, as well as noise and dust, for example. And then another really key area is the if you demolish and rebuild, then obviously that entails typically new materials, new products that then have to obviously be put into the built environment. And with those products and materials are inevitable impacts. So, for example, embodied carbon. And actually, we found through the examples of adaptive reuse, it actually really does promote creativity, innovation, and collaboration. And the examples you're going to see later on through our other presenters will really demonstrate that. Yeah, in the innovation and the creativity in particular. So it is a big focus for the circuit project. We're particularly looking at having 3 demonstrations in London so the idea initially is to identify what are the target types of buildings or assets. So we're not really looking at buildings or assets that are currently tend to be transformed for use. So those could be like the churches, for example, because it's already happening, or Victorian terrace housing, they're already being adapted and transformed and refurbished. So we're more looking at those buildings where they're tending to be demolished when they actually, through the technical lifespan, could be preserved and retained for a significant period into the future. So those are our targets. So we're really going through a process at the moment of identifying where we're going to focus our efforts. Then having done that, we'll then we'll produce some design strategies to actually undertake the adaptive reuse. So what's the refurbishment to an alternative application, and how can that then be replicated throughout London and beyond? And then finally, we'll be looking at the, as with all the demonstration projects and pilots, what was the benefits of doing that? You know, what were the environmental, economic, and social benefits derived from actually doing that adaptive reuse? And then obviously you could then look at, if you were able to replicate that, however many times it's likely to be replicated, what would be the sort of net benefit across the London area in particular. So that's the sort of link into the circuit project. So so that's the sort of introduction to it. Then I think we're now going to go on to the first presentation from Robert Schmidt III, and hopefully it will all queue in now. So we'll have questions at the end, I think, of all the presentations. So over to you, Robert. If you want to maybe give a bit more information about yourself, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As Julie said, I'm Rob Schmidt. I'm a senior lecturer at Loughborough University, where I lead the architecture group and programs. Kay, can everybody see my screen? Oh, here we go. Sorry. It's asked me to. Hopefully you can see my screen. So I'm going to talk very briefly this morning about adaptable lean, which positions architecture as a verb to unlock the building's capacity to accommodate change. I'm trying to confirm that my screen is visible.
Yes, Rob, we can see you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. So, which positions architecture as a verb to unlock the building's capacity to accommodate change. So I'll do my best in 10 minutes to explain this and give in the latter half of the presentation, give an example of a case study. So when I speak to my students, I always start by saying that our capacity to reuse our built assets is only limited by our imagination. whether that's a baseball stadium on the left turned into a model home showroom, or a Russian airliner used to extend a flat. We adapt stuff all the time to fit our needs. A bicycle frame becomes a lunchbox, a napkin, a bowl, a hammer, a doorstop. While living in Japan, I became fascinated with fixes which address everyday problems with leftover items, or what other people refer to as waste. You know, a frugal burner from wires, a PET bottle for an ashtray, a 10-centimeter scrap concrete planter for a curb, or aluminum cans as safety poles. So my interest in the evolution of our built environment and how we preserve that, as well as evolve that, started in Japan and transitioned then to the Adaptable Futures Research Group at Loughborough University, where we started by looking at how we can design more buildings to be more adaptable. And as Jilly highlighted, this is through a variety of design strategies, from modularity and modern methods of construction to spatial tenets such as open plan and simple form. However, the research very quickly began to not only look at designing an additional capacity to accommodate change in new buildings, through technologies and smart solutions, but what types of buildings were actually being adapted, the lessons that could be learned from these buildings, and how we could facilitate this process more effectively and efficiently. So, as Jilly mentioned, this is a cathedral in the Netherlands that was transformed to a bookshop. And this is sort of where the term adaptability came from, with a focus on understanding how to activate a building's capacity to change and to make the most out of existing resources, including the organization and or communities themselves. So we formed the understanding that adaptability or adaptive reuse comes down to more than the physical characteristics of the building, but a social occupational process that activates human agency alongside building agency. So to understand the kind of soft, more indeterminate sort of approaches that activates kind of human-centric ways of thinking about space in our buildings. So the research then developed a toolkit that we use, for discussing, for designing for, and evaluating the capacity for a building to accommodate change. And this morning, I'm just going to introduce one very small piece of this, which for our purposes today is focused on the center column, which highlights a subset of building characteristics. These characteristics, such as open space and component accessibility, spatial quality, are contextualized on the left-hand side through a higher level set of design strategies, such as modularity and loose fit, but also are operationalized on the right-hand side through a specific set of methods or design tactics. And it's this combination and this sort of pathways that we look to sort of define the specific recipe for adaptability in specific projects, because not all adaptability is appropriate for every project, and it's not necessarily the most is the best. So in the latter half of this presentation, I want to quickly share an example of how this capacity can be activated. The project is a Beacon School that was completed in late 2018 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The growth of Sao Paulo came in the very early 20th century and has given the city an industrial heritage. Its main heritage is not cultural buildings such as theaters. It's in industrial warehouses, but not the sort of European style brick warehouses, but large concrete and steel framed sheds. So this project is the conversion or adaptive reuse of a series of sheds or industrial sheds that were intermediately used as parking structures and then sort of converted into the school academy. The aerial photo here shows the location of the school in Sao Paulo. It's part of an industrial complex, which over 70% of the properties were empty at the time. It was a design competition that the architect won because of proposing a cohesive environment that brought the individual buildings together. Zooming out, you can see that the neighbors are actually a number of favelas adjacent to a series of rivers. But this is a very unique context for a school that is actually for elite children. And the school boldly decided to move here as a catalyst for the redevelopment of this area. And the architects, the school, and the community held a number of consultation meetings to discuss how the school could do more than service its elite population and provide opportunities for the local children to engage and interact with a community of children they normally would not. So this generated a master plan for the redevelopment and a revised charter for the school. So this is just an overview in plan. The site is made up of a number of concrete and steel frame sheds that in combination are, as I said, are converted to form a school academy for over 1,000 students from primary school to high school. These two images of the facades are just to give you a better sense of its change from its previous life and the sort of the rawness of the state of what it was in prior to its adaptive reuse. The diagram shows the basic zones for the academy, and I want to just highlight the gray square in the center, which is the true brilliance of the scheme that brings everyone sort of together. I like these two photos as it shows the old and new street. One which was a parking lot full of cars in its previous life is now a safe space for a variety of educational activities and has activated the open space with excellent natural light. The more detailed plan shows the inserted spaces with volumes capable of accommodating specific school activities and providing common areas like the street without specific purpose to host the diverse functions and encourage interactions between students, teachers, and other users. The section here gives a better sense of these insertions and illustrates how the design maintained natural ventilation and excellent amount of daylight from the original building form to create a passive green environment that includes rainwater harvesting, production of energy, and integrated shading. The conversion was about, creating an appropriate scale and materiality for an education environment, which included colorful planters, bright wooden furniture, to bring a warm contrast to the industrial shed. The infill spaces were actually constructed of light industrial modular elements that were assembled on site via dry connections that could be easily disassembled for future use elsewhere. This was in part because the school does not own the buildings, but operates with a 20-year lease, but also the mindset of the architect to enable more frequent change to happen at the infill level. The building itself was primarily stripped back to its raw structure, a mixture of concrete and metal frame structures. This exposed the sawtooth roof form, the metal trusses, which provided very generous spans, but also another less visible key feature was the 60-centimeter thick floor slab that allowed for large new loads. The building not only activates the indoor spaces, but also creates a fluid space between indoor and outdoor, using movable and adjustable furniture and equipment to support this. So I realize this is a very, very quick summary of the case study, but the adaptive reuse requires a building and community to maintain a degree of validity, to allow changes to be dealt with more easily, strategies that are more permeable to time, to exploit this. An historic narrative, for example, engages the human perception of time and associates the proposition as a new layer of history. This approach is bolstered through user comprehension, appreciation, and appropriation. That is afforded through simple and familiar buildings. This is such building types as Julia pointed out, of warehouses and terrace homes, but now even new typologies like shopping malls, mid-rise office buildings are beginning to be transformed into a variety of uses. So thank you very much, and I'm finished.
Thank you, Rob. Elma, I think you're muted.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I can share. Yeah, you can see me, but I think I will switch off my camera because sometimes there are some problems on the line with the camera streaming. So I will just focus on my presentation slides here. So that was me. Hello. Jilly introduced me shortly, and let's see. No. So Jilly introduced me shortly and said also that I do wear a number of hats. I try to do that simultaneously, which is quite difficult. But I will also try to put these two major hats I wear all the time in this presentation. One is of an architect. So I founded 4D Architects in Amsterdam many years ago with aim to explore the fourth dimension in a design and put a focus on the factor time in the time of use of building and operation of a building, as obviously that's where things very often go wrong. And if we want to reinvent the value of building and building materials, we do need to focus on the way buildings are used and also materials in the buildings through the whole life cycle. So the focus of the fourth dimension I used also to shift further to the research and to explore the ways how to change the perception of buildings, which we see mainly as static structures, and to develop tools and mechanisms that will help us to transform this perception from static to dynamic structures, which will enable to understand the reuse potential of materials in the buildings, what the value of these materials are, but also to understand the transformation potential of buildings. And equally important to develop strategies and tools and protocols for designers to enable and unlock future value of buildings during their operation and after the initial use of buildings. Because my major challenge, basically, I think, not only mine, but of many people these days, is that they do see buildings still being designed for one end of life, usually resulting in demolition. And if we are to unlock the future potential of building and its materials, we do need to focus on design. That's where everything starts. And that's where we need to try to unlock multiple reuse options of buildings and materials of them. And that's where these tools are coming in order to help us to understand the performance of our new generational buildings as we are to develop in this 21st century to support our life. In order to test these new strategies and tools, I also initiated two centers, laboratories in Europe. One is in the Netherlands, Laboratory for Green Transformer Buildings, where these tools of reuse potential and transformation and protocols are being implemented and tested, but also new concepts are developed. And in southeast of Europe, a Green Design Center, which I will be telling more about. So as I said, everything starts with the design. And my favorite definition of circular building is the one which I call reversible building. There's a building which has a capacity, a spatial and technical capacity to accommodate different use scenarios during the centuries, as is the case with the Amsterdam Canal houses. I live in Amsterdam and I've seen many of these, obviously. Those are canal houses built which are here for 600 years, and they all change their functions for 6 or 7 times, being a storage and a pharmacy, a bookshop, a dentist, dentist office, or whatever. And it was made possible not only by the spatial capacity that these canal houses have, but also by the technical capacity and the way the canal houses are put together, the structure of the building where the facade is loose from the structure, the floors can be taken out without affecting the structure, and so forth and so forth. So the real unlocking of the future potential lays on one hand side on the spatial capacity of the building and on the technical capacity on the other hand. And why reversible monuments? Obviously, looking at the canal houses, which are very appreciated by the people, there is an additional design task, the one that communicates with the values of communities and people and make them stay longer in that respect as well. So this is something, this approach of understanding how to unlock the future potential of buildings, and in way of also exploring the aspects of reversible monuments in effect as what they mean to the people and the neighborhoods. The buildings are there which give identity to the streets and the cities. Be approached on location of Green Design Center in Maastricht, which was given to us to do whatever we want to do with the structure. And obviously we came across a ruin for which many people thought it needs to be demolished. It is a former military barrack built hundreds of years ago by Austro-Hungarian army. And it has been totally devastated also in last happenings in that region. So that was a location we were given to set up a new creative center that will investigate new circular and reversible concepts of construction and help people understand how we can move the construction of future in that region. So first thought were put aside. Demolish was not an option in our case, and what we've done is did of course the analysis of technical capacity of the structure, what the structure can do. There are some very robust elements which could be reused for the future as a future load-bearing structure, but also the spatial capacity, whether we can accommodate number of use options that were meant to be placed in this center. And of course, there is this identity of the building. There are some very characteristic elements of the building which would be interesting to keep and to keep for the future. So instead of demolishing, came into with a solution of using and understood that the existing structure is robust enough that it can be used as springboard for the future developments and explorations of the world of building in the future. And it can be seen maybe even as a symbolic elements in it, as this location was previously used by the military. Obviously, previous generations needed to fight for their survival and well-being by force, by military, and the future generations will obviously need to fight for the well-being by knowledge. So I found that also quite interesting to reuse this site, military site, use the robustness of what we have inherited to build on a new reversible structure that will explore future potentials of new methods of construction, which will enable adaptability of the building also in the future by the way it has been built and the space has been used. So it is meant to be used by the students and will be transformed regularly using this robust military industrial heritage as the base for these explorations and transforming something which was seen as a waste, something that needs to be, people wanted to get rid of, into giving it a new life for the future. And obviously this did result in some environmental savings and reduction of waste and CO2, which comes along with this approach. So, sorry. This approach seemed to be quite interesting for the city authorities, and as the city has like hundreds of these kind of buildings, where you need to understand the transformation potential. What can you do with that? What is its spatial and technical structure telling you? And kind of framework has been developed to understand and develop transformation approaches for the city in unlocking the future potential of these kind of buildings using the transformation potential model, which are developed along some other tools to help designers, but also city authorities to understand the capacities of existing buildings, industrial heritage, also in that area, to reuse them for new purposes. Another case I wanted to share with you is another approach when we talk about adaptive houses and buildings. We usually think about reusing the whole building, but basically we can think about reusing of space, removing space from place to place and so forth. And that's something that has been investigated in the Netherlands, in the south of the Netherlands, in the mining area, which is now being going under transformation. And in the next 30 years, like 56,000 apartment buildings need to be demolished. And the idea came up to investigate whether the existing buildings can be seen as the material banks, but also for the future buildings, but whether the space can be reused. And when I say space, it means literally taking the parts of the building out and adapting them for new use. In this case, these parts of the buildings have been cut out of the apartment blocks, and new houses have been built. So the aim of the project was to basically investigate different reuse options on the element and material level, but also on the unit and level in terms of taking remodeling parts of the spatial parts of the building. And this is the results, the 3 houses being constructed using 95% of the Dorner building next door, and literally reusing the 3D units, remodeling them in order to change their use as being apartments and become a house or one or other type of house. And obviously, this is quite an interesting approach. It is an experiment. What we did see and learn here is that if we want to reuse parts of the building which was never designed to be adapted or recovered, then we have to deal with huge economic costs. And in this case, the reuse of these kind of parts of the building which are adapted for a new purpose would be 10 times more expensive than building a new house. So that also tells us that we still have to do lots of work on understanding the impact of the way we construct, the impact of the way we have built buildings in the past. And obviously with this kind of technique, we did measure huge environmental impact in terms of reusing parts of the building and making a new house of that. But on the other hand, quite negative economic impact in terms that the whole house in the end was 3 times more expensive than a conventional house. And this brings me to my last slides, actually.
You have to make it very quick, Elma, sorry.
Yes, somewhere where I started trying to say everything starts with the design, and this capacity also an impact, environmental and economic impact of the buildings and what we can do with them will depend on the way we design the buildings. And if we say that demolition and value degradation is design mistake, that means we need to start designing differently. And these are the method and other tools that I have developed in order to try to help different parties, stakeholders, to understand the reversibility of buildings and their capacity from technical and spatial point of view, and to link these to environmental and economic aspects. And based on this, develop a circularity profiles. So that would be my last slide.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Elma. We've had a question about how to measure circularity in the built environment. I've just put a point into the answer to say that we've actually got another workshop starting at 11 that's all about circularity metrics. So if you haven't signed up to that, I think that's that will hopefully answer that question in great detail. So we probably only have time for one question at the end. So moving on to Peter Swallow. So yeah, so if you can maybe try to do it in 10 minutes or less, then we have time for that last question at the end. Okay, thanks a lot, Peter. Off you go.
Thanks, Julie. So yes, I will try and keep this as brief as possible. Grimshaw have been involved in this project for 44 years, so I've got quite a challenge on my hand to keep it within 10 minutes. First, I'm going to take you through the reimagining of the Herman Millen building, which is a project that we first became involved in back in 1976. I'm just trying to advance my slides here. Yeah, so the site of the project was out to the west of Bath, relatively close to the town centre in an industrial zone. The original premise for the project was for a factory sort of headquarters for Herman Miller, who had a presence. They were from the US. They have a presence in the UK and Europe. They really wanted to establish themselves with a production factory in the UK, and this was one of their first projects and our first collaboration with them across a number of schemes that we ended up doing for them starting in the 1970s. The project was completed in 73. The project was currently, was then listed in 2013, and then it was acquired by the University of Bath Spa in 2016, and then we became shortly thereafter involved to deliver the reimagining of the building into the Bath School for Art and Design, which completed last year. The original brief for the project was set by Max Dupree, who was the CEO of Herman Miller, and he, along with Nick, were really the protagonists of the whole brief, and really honing exactly what was wanted of the building. And I've got two quotes here that are quite informative from Max himself. He wanted it to be possible to say that our goal is to build the indeterminate building, and obviously Nick's preoccupation and one of the drivers for his early work was buildings have to adapt to change, and this was very much born out of his working with people like Buckminster Fuller back in the 70s, and obviously the drivers back then were slightly different in terms of energy crisis and looking at the lack of materials and an early understanding of environmental impacts that we as humanity have on the planet. So it was really something that became part of Nick's thinking when he designed projects. So obviously those sort of meeting of minds in the early days of the genesis for the brief really led to a situation where we ended up with a very succinct brief, which was essentially trying to distill down exactly what was needed for the scheme. And one of the key criteria was obviously allowing for adaptability, allowing for this production supply chain and processes that Herman Miller were developing for their products to evolve over time. So they wanted a space that was forgiving. They also wanted a space that was able to change to scale for their operation. Things about us will change was something that they acknowledged, and we will change as an entity. Nick was very keen to encompass that, embody that in the actual expression of the architecture. And I've got one of Nick's quotes here that the client obviously was a household name at the time, Herman Miller, and still is. And the brief essentially was so short that it was essentially a poem, and that was actually something after completion of the scheme. The project was actually published, and actually the practice actually put out a booklet which essentially sort of showed the codification of the brief and how that was played out as a scheme. We actually in terms of the actual realization of the project, it was essentially looking at creating what was dubbed the super room, which was a large flexible volume. And that was really the premise for the whole project, taking the brief and synthesizing it down into what could actually be delivered. And the idea was that this would be a space which Herman Miller could inhabit, and they could also adapt as they went through and really worked out what they wanted to get from the space. So it had that inherent flexibility built in. It was also then something that was manifest around the entire sort of thinking about specification of systems. So all the way through from the structure being on a regular grid and creating large span column-free spaces, all the way through to having a space which was essentially something you could pull apart and put back together. And that's evident here from the facade. You can actually take the panels off. This was an early example of a curtain wall system that was put on the building, which is very unusual for a factory of this type in that time. But it allowed them to move window panels, solid panels, and they could actually reconfigure the office spaces and support spaces internally. There was also a real emphasis on creating a service spine, which allowed you to then plug and play the various components within the assembly line. And then this all sort of led towards the democratization of the factory floor space, so that people felt connected to the outside. They felt there was a non-hierarchical approach to the way they worked, and that was very much sort of embedded in the philosophy of Herman Miller, and still is today. So moving on to the scheme for Bath School and what we actually had to do in terms of formulating their brief and then delivering this project using this existing building. The premise was that they wanted to move the various different components of the school that were spread across the city into a single unified campus. So there were challenges involved in that from the outset. There was also then looking at how do you use an existing building and adapt your requirements and work out where you're willing to compromise to use an existing structure. There was also the project involved a lot of renovation of the existing building. Whilst it sort of stood up well to the test of time, there were spaces where there was really going to be focused efforts to have to modernize and update some of the components that are well past their end of life phase. And this was interesting insofar as as I said earlier, the building was listed just before the university acquired the property, and this was something that we worked very closely with the conservationists at the planning department to actually make them understand that, and this was where it was great that we'd been involved in the project from day one, was Nick was able to communicate to them that the essence of what was trying to be conserved here wasn't the visual aesthetic, but it was actually the adaptability and the inherent underlying adaptability of the systems that we used, and that was the thing that needed to be preserved, and hence that would allow the university to evolve the building without being too constrained by maintaining a fixed visual aesthetic. The other thing was humanizing the building. We were trying to turn something that was essentially a production facility into something that could be fit for occupation by people coming together to collaborate and obviously create art and create good design. The university early on inhabited the building when they bought the building, so they could start to understand how the space was used, and they could start to understand what they wanted to get from it. And then there were specific design interventions that came out of the briefing process and their early sort of occupation of the building. The first thing for us was repairing what was called deemed the super room concept. Obviously, over time, Herman Miller had adapted the building, and they put rather conventional office spaces, as you can see at the top of the screen here. All of that was stripped out, and we went right back to first principles in terms of creating adaptable and flexible sort of modular planning within the building. So all of the rooms could be, all of the walls internally could be moved to allow for flexibility of carving up the space in different configurations depending on the needs of the university. Another aspect was trying to avoid intervention within the existing structure of the building. So we created different zones where there were heavily serviced workshops, and then there were softer spaces around the edges of that. And these were designed to be in locations that would avoid impacting too heavily on the facade and on the existing structure. And we also had a number of interventions where we had to actually take away some of the materiality of the building, but we obviously limited this. And the main area was the roof structure. We looked at actually raising the roof in order to get more daylight into the scheme. And at the same time, we reinforced the existing steel trusses in order to strengthen the scheme to be more code compliant. So you can see here the roof has been elevated from the existing scheme through to the from the scheme before through to the what is now the final solution for the roof, and that's allowed a lot more flexibility in terms of spatial planning internally. We're not limited to putting offices around the perimeter. There was also, as I said earlier, going back to this concept of the super shed, sort of super space, you've got an evolution of this concept of having adaptable paneling systems with plug and play elements that allow you to take all the servicing from high level down into the panels, and then you can essentially dial up and dial down the various different requirements that you have for spaces, so you can have more privacy, less privacy. You can change the acoustics all within that system that's been developed for the scheme. And you can see here just some of the final images of the scheme of what we've actually ended up with. And the last one was just looking at the facade. This was something as a sort of final talking point. The facade was conceived as a glass reinforced plastic panel insert within a curtain wall system, and we looked at what we could do we had to retain that as part of the requirements for the building's listing. So we had to identify panels that could be kept, panels that needed to be refurbished, but we also looked at adapting the scheme so that we could bring in more modern elements and more to meet more modern sort of more modern building regulation requirements. So we increased the thermal properties of the curtain wall, but we still have that underlying functionality of being able to swap out the panels. So if the university wanted to change out the panels in the future and swap the glazing for the solid panels, they could. And we also allowed for an internal lining which would allow them to put pin boards and pin-up space for the students. And you can just see here the way that component comes apart. What's the key message here is that the inherent flexibility that was built in and specified within the building at the outset of the project, we've really had the opportunity to see if those intentions have been borne out. But at the same time, we've also been able to capitalize on using that inherent flexibility that was built in on day one and actually benefit the university by having those systems already in place. So you can just see here some final images. The only other thing that we did that was new, entirely new for the scheme, was to put a new pavilion on the top of the building. But we looked at doing this with as minimal sort of intervention and interface with the existing building. So we did this essentially, what we said, changing with grace. We put a new independent structure in that floated above the existing and allowed us to create this very sort of modern, crisp glass insert that sat above the building, but didn't detract the eye from the original building. And didn't sort of overshadow it or take away from the original building. So you can just see some final shots here. The final thing I'll say is just in terms of process, we also were able to update the archiving of the existing building information through digital scanning. We created a full BIM level 2 model. So we've obviously now got for the next generation, for the next maybe iteration of this building, there's much more detailed documentation that can be used to help assist its adaptation to change. And if there's a user that comes after the university, they've got the means to be able to maximize the full potential of this building. And lastly, I'll just finish the other documentation we did, which was quite unique, was we actually brought in an artist to sort of document it from the point of view of what the space feels like, what the transition and change has happened over time. And this goes back to the idea of, if the building has a story to tell and people have an affinity with the building, they're much more likely to cherish it and maintain it and keep it in active service for as long as possible. So I will conclude there. I think I've just managed to scrape into the 10-minute mark there, maybe just
yeah, a little bit over, but it's a very nice project. So yeah, and you also kept saying and finally, so you were able to get a few more slides in. That's quite a cunning technique actually. Great, thank you everybody. Thanks all the presenters for all these fabulous demonstration projects. And actually we're out of time, but hopefully people can stay on for a few more minutes because I think a really interesting question to answer for all of you, which I've sort of taken from one of the questions is, how do we scale this up? You've shown some brilliant examples, but how do we actually scale it up? So if you can each maybe just answer that in a minute each, that would be fabulous. So I don't know, Rob, do you want to start?
Scale it up in terms of the neighbor, like building scale, or?
Yeah, just more of these sorts of, adaptive reuse, and it could be, more of the same buildings or more happening across a neighborhood area, however you want to answer the question.
I mean, I think just very quickly, I think, a lot of what was said today has to do with a kind of mindset and appreciation for our built heritage and understanding that we're only limited by our imagination. All three demonstration projects, in some sense, look like ruins to a certain level, and yet where they're sort of reactivated to, to an incredible, functional and beautiful sort of state. And I think, if we can do that with those types of buildings, imagine what we can do with buildings that are in much better condition. So I think a lot of it comes down to mindset and a kind of appreciation and imagination for what is possible, and unlocking, as you started, unlocking in a kind of creativity that takes advantage of human capacity to adapt and to accommodate change that might not necessarily be completely fit for purpose in its kind of new state, if you will. So I think it's sorry, I think that'll be good for me.
I just want to leave something for the other two to say. So Elma, have you got anything to add to that?
I was done. I wasn't going to do a couple finalies. Don't worry. I was done.
Elma, can you add to that? Would you want to ask a different question? Elma? Okay, maybe Peter,
Yes,
if you want to. Elma, off you go.
Yeah, I can add to that. I would like to go, I absolutely agree with what Robert said, but I would like to go step further and say we need to push for legislation and procurement that will recognize these future values and bring them into the brief and requirements for the designers and construction industry to build buildings which do have this kind of future potential that can be unlocked after first use and can be transformed later on. So I think that we need to make a step further and involved and make some changes in the legislation and procurement strategies.
Great, thank you. And Peter, I know it's difficult because you've now last. Is there anything else you think could be useful to help scale this up so it becomes much more the norm?
Yeah, I think I'll echo what Elma said there, is that the policy is key. I think obviously we had the advantage of being involved on Herman Miller from the very sort of genesis of the project, but often developers don't have that luxury. And I think being able to intervene at the very outset of when a developer gets on board and evaluates a project and starts to decide whether it's eligible for being refurbished or for being demolished, I think that's key. Getting in there very early and having a relationship with the developers from the outset is going to be key to maximising the potential of a lot of buildings that would otherwise just be torn down because of the economics involved.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I found it absolutely fascinating, all the different projects and demonstrations, etc. I'm sure everybody's learned a lot. There are some other questions. I'm not sure if Kay just wants to come in to say, is there any way to maybe answer those questions later? Is there any, or do we have to hold that thought?
Yeah, we can try to respond to some of the questions by email after. There's some specific questions, so we can try to address those, and we'll share the presentation slides after, and this has been recorded, so very good for follow-up to take a look at the slides and maybe directly contact the presenters.
Great. So I don't know if, hopefully we're okay to share your email details or other contact details, and then we'll also let you know the questions that are asked specifically to yourselves. So thank you, everybody. And we've got a few minutes before the next workshop starts. I think the details are in the chat box. And hopefully some of you can join us at the next workshop. But thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you, Julie. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.